Hi, Body and Messiah. Today we're going to cover UBP Lesson 12. And in this lesson, we're going to cover specifically explain the 400-year prophecy. This is a prophecy that was given to Patriarch Abraham, or Abram at the time, in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 14. We're going to go into detail to explain our perspective at Geographical Bible Studies because many people are conflicted about this 400-year prophecy. They believe it's only applicable to the time of when the descendants of Israel were in Egypt and captivity and slavery in Egypt. But I'm giving my perspective personally and the perspective of Geographical Bible Studies why this is not only specific, it's partially fulfilled by Egypt, but not totally. And we're going to give that perspective here. So let's go ahead. First, we're going to read Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 14, specifically those two verses, because what we're going to focus on is two details in there that shows that this prophecy is partially applicable to Egypt. Egypt, remember that terminology, as we said before. Here we go. In Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. Patriarch Abraham has fallen asleep after he's placed the offering out there for Adonai, and he has a nightmare. When he wakes from this nightmare, Adonai explains to him why he had this terrible nightmare. And he says, "Then he said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. Verse 14, but I'm going to judge the nation that they will serve. Afterwards, they will go out with many possessions." Okay, Body Messiah, here is how this prophecy partially fulfills what happened in Egypt. God has told Abraham that your seed will be strangers in this land. Okay? And that's true. When we look in Exodus chapter 22 and Exodus chapter 23, when the children of Israel are coming out of the Exodus, out of Egypt, there are some things that Adonai warns them of. So this proves that they were strangers in that land. He tells them, be kind to the foreigners among you. Be kind to them, because you also were foreigners or strangers in Egypt. So he's telling them to be kind to those who have come into the community. They're abiding by the standards of the Most High God, being grafted in Hebrews. But he says, be kind to them, these foreigners or strangers, because you also were strangers in Egypt. But here's the part that to me points to the fact that it's not only and couldn't be applicable to Egypt. It says that your seeds will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. This is the part right here that tells me this is a land that's other than Egypt. Because when we look at the covenant that the Most High God made with Patriarch Abraham, you can look at the boundaries of the land that he promised to him in the covenant. When you look in Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 19, Adonai is promising him the land of Canaan, and the boundaries are defined for the land of Canaan. Okay? Not every place that the people of Canaan reside, but specifically the land. We cover this in detail in Geographical Bible Studies. So this is what leads me to believe that this 400-year prophecy was partially fulfilled by Egypt. But the entirety and the totality of this prophecy says that your seed will be strangers in that land, in a land that is not theirs. So it's not a part of the land that is a part of the covenant that Patriarch Abraham was promised by the Most High God. We can go on and look here in Joshua chapter 24, verses 3 through 4. Here is a summary that the Most High God has given the children of Israel before Joshua, Moshe, that, this is what I did. I took your forefathers from their land to bring them into this land of Canaan. Okay, and he's explaining this to them. But notice what he specifically says in here. So verse 3 says, and I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him throughout the entire land of Canaan and multiplied his offspring. So this happened. He led him into the land throughout the entire land of Canaan. And we're going to review and show you steadily that Patriarch Abraham, once he left his land of where he resided and his forefather Terah, that he dwelled down through the land of Canaan, and that included Egypt, what they called Egypt, based on biblical translations. Okay? The next verse says, then to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave to Esau Mount Seir to possess it as his own. But Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. Okay? He's stating that he gave Mount Seir to Esau to possess as his own. And then the very next thing he says, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. That's not stated as if it's something that's going against God's standard or against his desires. It's not going against it. He's saying that's where they went. So this is okay with the Most High God. Now let me share with you the path in which Patriarch Abraham took as he's going. I'm going to share some scriptures that you can go back and read the whole chapters of on your own. So, because it's going to reinstill this fact, right? Okay, as you can see, we have Genesis chapter 12. Go to Genesis chapter 12 and read it in its entirety. Genesis chapter 12 is where the Most High God is telling Patriarch Abram, go out of the land from which your forefathers are, where you reside. I want you to take you into another land, right? So when you read that whole chapter, that's what he's telling him to do. So he's leaving and he's going down into the land of Canaan. And it states in verse 14, when Abram came to Egypt. So he came into the land of Egypt. So this is a land that's away from his forefather. This is a land that is promised, a part of the covenant. Now go to Genesis chapter 13 and look at verse 12 specifically. And it says that Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan. Okay. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, you'll see by the end of that chapter, he goes amongst the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh, tries to court Sarah, and the Pharaoh gets in trouble, and he realizes that, this is Abram's wife, and so he was like, I'm sorry, I apologize. Here's you a lot of gifts, a lot of cattle, a lot of livestock. Go about your way. By Genesis 13, it's him, Patriarch Abraham, and Lot are roaming around, and they have a lot of possessions and a lot of people who are dwelling with them. And so they have to go their separate ways here. But there's still, Patriarch Abraham is dwelling in the land of Canaan. Now, even when we go on down to Genesis chapter 20, we see this is where Patriarch Abraham encounters Abimelech of Gerar. This is another leader or king who tries to court Sarah, and he finds out, because God puts the fear in him, that this Sarah is Abram's wife. And so he sends Patriarch Abraham and Sarah off with gifts. Just get on out of here. But it says that he's king over Gerar. And Gerar is, King Abimelech is king over the Philistines. Now, if you go back and look at a previous video that has the biblical heritage chart, you'll notice that the Philistines are descendants of Ham. So you have Ham and Ham's descendant, Mizraim. Mizraim is Egypt's, the Egyptian descendants. And under Mizraim is a tribe called the Cashlubites. The Caslubites are also known as the Philistines. So this goes to show you that this promised land that they're calling Egypt is also a part of Canaan. Now, I want you to go to Isaiah chapter 19, verse 16 through 25. And specifically, this is a chapter that's talking about these verses about the judgment on the Egyptians because of their idolatry and their rebellion and how God had to chastise them. But by the end of it, he says that they're going to know Adonai. They're going to come back to him. And specifically in verse 25 here, he says, "Blessed is Egypt, my people." He's calling them his people. Okay? Now, I'm going to go on and show you that Egypt, as we've known throughout history, that whenever biblical scriptures were translated and to refer to the continent of Africa, it was known by three things. It was known as Egypt, Ethiopia, or the land of Cush. Those were the three names that the whole continent of Africa was known as. So this right here is showing you that this is a part of the land of Canaan. And we'll go on to show you, refer to some videos that Geographical Bible Studies has out there, where we prove on geographical documentation and historical old maps of Africa that the boundaries in the land of Canaan is all throughout Africa. Okay? But let's cover this one other section of these two scriptures here. One is a prophecy given in Hosea chapter 11. And in the first verse, the latter half of it, there's the prophet is saying that God is going to call his son out of Egypt. Okay? Which is referring to the continent, the fatherland, Africa. And then there's confirmation of that by the time you get to Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. Right? So here we have in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. This is where the angel of Adonai told Joseph, "Get up and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt." Right? And it goes on to say, this will fulfill the words of Adonai when he spoke and said, "Out of Egypt I call my son." Okay, so he's calling his son out of Egypt. And where in Egypt? And from Nazareth. Now, in the very first lesson of Africa Throughout the Bible, which is a part of the TBON, Take Back Our Narrative series, part 1, I cover where Nazareth is located in Ethiopia. Nazareth was known as Nazareth in ancient times. And this is in Ethiopia. Today they call it mostly Adama in Ethiopia. So this proves to you that when the scripture says, "I'm calling my son out of Egypt," he's called him out. And the confirmation is stated in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. He's calling his son, which is our Messiah, out of Egypt. And Egypt is referring to the continent of Africa, and specifically Nazareth, which is located in Ethiopia. So by the Messiah, there's no mistaking. So when this 400-year prophecy says that Abraham's seed will be strangers in that land, okay, I get it. Yes, America, Central America, South America, and some other parts of the world where we were scattered, ancient descendants of Israel. And it says a land that is not theirs, okay? So the Americas and some other parts of the world, like India, where some descendants of Africans were enslaved and taken there by some European, leaders who were colonizing India. This happened. We were taken to a land that is not ours. And this is confirmation of the scriptures. Now, the only place I can definitively vouch for fulfilling that prophecy is the United States of America. The first African slave was recorded being brought to this continent in 1619. Okay, this is confirmation. It could have been before, but definitively 1619 definitely. Could have happened in the 1500s. It has been 400 years. And steady on like almost a 100-year cycle or pattern, we're fighting for more rights of equality when it comes to the justice system, when it comes to trying to be held equal standards when it comes to financial justice, as far as receiving compensation for injustice. All of this stuff, we are continuously fighting it. But if the first recorded African slave was here in 1619, then the 400 years has come to an end in 2019. This is why you see such a great awakening in the Americas and throughout the world right now. You see all these ancient descendants of Israel waking up and coming to life because God's prophecy is being fulfilled. Now it says in the scriptures that afterwards, it says that he's going to judge that nation. And we've seen that God's judgment is continuously falling on the U.S. and other parts of the world, and the European countries specifically too. He said he was going to judge them, and they're going to continue to fall as long as the injustice intensifies and keeps being so blatant against the children of Israel. And that's his promise. Look, even if you don't want to believe in this 400-year prophecy here, based on Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 7, it says to the descendants of Israel, as long as we cleave and follow the standards of the Most High God and his command, all of those curses that used to be placed on our ancestors in Egypt or while we were enslaved and in captivity will fall upon those who hate us. So no matter what, if you do or don't believe in it, judgment is falling on America and other nations because of their mistreatment of the descendants of Israel. And as we begin to cleave closer to the Most High God and follow his standards, the judgments are going to intensify as long as injustice carries on. Now it says at the end, afterwards they will go out with many possessions. That did happen once our ancestors left captivity in Egypt. But also for now, I want you to understand that most of the ancient descendants of Israel have many possessions in these other countries that we're in. Now, that could mean that there's financial compensation, but I want to take this moment to say something, make something very clear. That's possible. It could mean reparations, financial compensation, right? But me being a follower of Adonai's word, if a government is offering compensation and they require you to take a mark or this mark, you are not to take that. That is not a part of God's plans. You understand what I'm saying? That is a mark that is to mark you for idolatry, to fall up under all of the judgments that are going to fall on the beast system. Okay? So there's no trade-off. Reparations is not about submitting to a system. It's compensation because of all of the injustice that has happened for hundreds of years to try and even the playing field. Okay? And if the nations are not going to do that, fine. God's judgments are going to continue to fall until our Messiah returns. All right? But don't get it twisted and think, the governments are offering us compensation and now you need to take this mark or this chip, this implant. Not I, and not any of the descendants of Israel. Because we who follow God's standards know what it means when we look in the book of Revelation. That's the mark of the beast. Now, let me go ahead and continue here. Now, Psychical Bible Studies has shown, when we look at TBON Lesson 2, Part 6, we've shown you where Patriarch Abraham traveled. We've shown all throughout that lesson of how he traveled throughout Middle Africa, Upper Africa, Lower Africa, South Africa, back up over towards Benin, Dan, near Nigeria. So he's traveled this whole route. When you look in Genesis chapter 14, we cover this in detail here. So that proves to you that he knows the land, and this is a part of the land of Canaan that our Most High God led him throughout. We show you here in TBLN Lesson 2, Part 7, we show you the great river, which is mentioned as part of the boundaries. When it says here in the boundaries that's given for Canaan, it says, on that day, a covenant with Abraham, Adonai cut a covenant with Abraham, saying, I give this land to your seed from the river of Egypt. Is not that in Egypt / Africa, the land of Cush? Okay. To the great river. We cover specifically the great river in one of the lessons that's found in one of the old maps of Africa. And then to the river Euphrates. It mentions in verse 19 several of these tribes: the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, the Jebusites. We cover these different groups here, these tribes, in TBON Lesson 2, Part 9 and Part 10. Okay? We even show you here in Part 6, when we talk about in Genesis chapter 14, when Patriarch Abraham get together all of his skilled men, about 318, it also includes some Amorites who are his allies, who go and chase down these rulers in order for Patriarch Abraham to overtake these kings and get his nephew Lot back. Okay? So we have all of this detail. Let me show you. I created an attachment that's going to go with TBON Lesson 2, Part 6 and on. In Part 6 in the description, I'm going to attach an attachment that will show you for Part 6, 7, 8, all the way through 10 of how we've covered these spots from ancient maps in Africa. But I want to share with you one in particular, the Great River. And it was shown in an old map of Africa, probably the predecessor to the Negro Land map. It is a 1710 map. And you can see here that in the region that's over here across where Benin, Nigeria goes, all the way from Senegal on, there's this great river channel. And it was labeled the Great, and you'll see space over there, a river. And then you see at the top, Berisa. Now, we covered in this lesson, Part 7, in detail, what Berisa means. Isa Beri is in a type of etymology or language to a people that's indigenous to Africa as the Great River. So this covers all the boundaries and the detail, body of Messiah. So you can't be mistaken. So either we're going to take the words of the Most High God or the standards of man. Either way it goes, like I said before, if you believe in this prophecy or choose not to, this great awakening is occurring. So especially Black and brown Hebrews and descendants of Israel, please wake up and teach your next generation. Teach this current generation and the next generation of how we all are returning back to the standards of the Most High God, so we will be under his shield of protection. Now, let me mention that we're coming up on a time that a lot of people in the U.S. and probably worldwide recognize as being Easter. Now, one part of learning and turning back to the standards of the Most High God is knowing that we celebrate Passover instead of Easter. What they have deemed as Easter is an alteration or a way to try and alter what Passover means for us as descendants of Israel, us as Hebrew people. Go back to Exodus chapter 12, and pretty soon, some people call Easter or whatever, or Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Breads, because when you read Exodus chapter 12, it talks about on the 14th day, you cannot have any leaven, any yeast, any bread that rises, within your household or partake of eating it. And then for 7 days, you're not to do that. And then after that 7 days, you can have the bread with the yeast and celebrate the Passover by having a meal. Okay? But we need to read in the details the importance of acknowledging the Passover. God asked us to remember it and to celebrate it once a year. So I'm not here to tell you, inside your Bible studies is not here to tell you how to celebrate it. We're just saying you need to acknowledge it so we can begin to return back to these standards. Listen, come to find out, 2020 Passover was a genuine Passover. When we look at all the things that have happened in this past year and this plague that has hit. So honoring the Most High God will not go against his standard if we abide by acknowledging it. So I encourage you, body of Messiah, in the wake of probably some more information you've learned from this 400-year prophecy, that you begin to turn back to his standards. Read to your children or your current generation when Passover occurs, Exodus chapter 12, so we can understand that God had mercy on us, even way back then. When the blood of the Lamb was over the door, he had mercy on us and shielded and protected us from our firstborn dying. So let's turn back to that standard. We know that we're covered by our Messiah, who was the living sacrifice for us. And so we glorify the Most High God by having that grace on us to allow us to enjoy this time and enjoy it with peace with your family and your loved one, but also take time out to teach them. Well, this is the end of UBP Lesson 12. And like I always say to you, body Messiah, may Adonai Elohim cover and surround you and your family, shield and protect you, and envelop you all in his shalom peace. Goodbye.